All right. As I said, we are moving towards wrapping up um, all the end time prophecies from the book of Revelation. And this has been an interesting journey because one of the things I read this week as I was studying, and it was absolutely true from the writer because he's also a pastor, is that, we at times as teachers and as preachers, pastors, we tend to maybe shy away from the book of Revelation because of the intensity of the scenery, the intensity of the judgments, the intensity of the wrath that we see. We don't want to scare people off, but when we do that, we kind of miss the point of why God gave John this revelation, why God gave to John on the Isle of Patmos. Here's what to anticipate. Here's what's going to happen. And every time he says, and then I saw, moving forward with events, it's important that we do that because it leads to these last two chapters. I mean, think about everything that we have studied up until this point, right? There are times we've had to say as we've talked through it, don't be discouraged. Don't let it frighten you in such a way that it keeps you from studying God's word, but understand it in the sense of God's bigger picture is that, when he put man in the garden, when he said, let there be light, he had Jesus in mind so that we would get to this place. But all in between, we have seen that not only does sin have effect on people, but sin also has effect on communities. It has effects on the physical earth, because even Paul goes on to say, all the earth is groaning, waiting for restoration, for redemption, waiting for this moment that we have been talking about. And it can be discouraging when you read so much of it, but I think, God always has a purpose when he gives us that much detail. And if you've studied much with me, you know that is that, God gives detail when he wants us to have detail, when he knows we need detail, right? And again, these details are not to scare, but they are to motivate and they are to encourage to say, we still have time. And even as we get into these last two chapters, you'll see God continuing to say that for John to write, for people to hear that we're not there yet. We haven't gotten to this place of tribulation. We hadn't gotten to this place of things coming to an end. And so there's still time, right? And that should motivate us. But and so again, thinking about where we are right now, it's interesting. Well, I think it's quite beautiful because now we have a major transition, right? Because the bowl judgments are done, okay? And Jesus came down, took care of everything, wiped out Satan and his army. All right, they were all banished to Hades. All right, sent the minions were sent to the lake of fire. All that stuff. I mean, the two beasts were sent to the lake of fire. Right. Then we had the 1,000-year reign, and at the end of this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between the millennial reign and the new heaven and the new earth, because we cannot confuse those two. Because the millennial reign is an earthly reign, earth as we know it now. All right, and so you got to keep that in mind. But what we saw at the end of the millennial reign is that Satan was given one more chance. He was released, the Gog and Magog thing, where people came out, okay, and people could turn against God again. And these armies gathered around the city of Jerusalem, and God sends a fire and wipes them out. And then we see that last judgment taking place, the judgment for unbelievers taking place. And it is at that point that I truly believe, because it talks about everything being thrown into the lake of fire, that fire that's around the city of Jerusalem, judgment. I truly believe it is at that point that God says, now it's time for the new heaven and the new earth. Okay. And so we're seeing the old heaven and the old earth pass away and the new one coming down. Right. And here's where I want us to understand this morning. There has been this long-term understanding that earth will be annihilated and earth will be destroyed. Right. We kind of get that from passages like in 2 Peter, where he talks about the earth being destroyed by fire. We get it from the promises to Noah when he came off the ark. God said it won't be a flood, it will be a fire next time. And when we hear that, we think of just being totally wiped out, nothing left whatsoever. Right? But that's not the case, because what we see here as we move forward is earth being redeemed and restored and joined together with the new heaven, all taking place here. Okay. So let's look at some of this morning. Chapter 21, I'm going to read the first several verses, and I'm going to go slow this morning. There's so much here, and the reason I'm going to go slow is that I want you to truly appreciate what heaven is going to be like, right? It is not this esoteric, otherworldly, spiritual place, right? That doesn't look anything. And people say, I have no idea what heaven looks like. Well, yes, you do. You're about to find out. All right. And so I want us to move slow through it. And so if that means we've got to continue the next week to finish up, that's fine. We will work that out, because this piece is key. These last two chapters are key to understanding all that God does at the end time. Okay. So then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I'm making all things new. Also he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage. I will be his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Okay. Again, remember where we are, right? John has just seen the final judgment taking place, the judgment of unbelievers taking place, and everything was wiped out. Everything was gone, right? There's been the 1,000-year reign, okay? And what John sees now, he says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth has passed away. Okay? The sense that we see from these Greek words, even pointing back to the Old Testament, is not a replacement, but a restoration. Right? In other words, the essence of the earth, the essence of the heavens are not gone. Much like if you know much about forest management, it's not unusual, every however many years they do it, it's not unusual for them to do controlled burns in some areas, right? Because as the forest gets too big and too thick, too many of the wrong things take over. And so the fire comes in and purifies and wipes that out. Now, you and I, I know that happens a lot. We'll drive, when we get down to Florida every year for our vacation, we drive through these national parks or state parks, and we see where things are burned. So, like, oh my goodness, that caught on fire. Many times, it's not that it's caught on fire, it's that rangers have set areas on fire for renewal to take place. Right? And that's the picture that is being painted here, right? Because when God created in Genesis 1, when God created the heavens and the earth, that was what we were to spend eternity with God in, right? That picture there of heavens and earth, the cosmos, the physical earth, the stars, all of those things. That's what God intended. What messed it up? Sin messed it up, right? Satan was there tempting Adam and Eve. They fell for that. They fell into sin, right? And God didn't say he would wipe it out completely. He said it would be restored. Even when he said to Noah, not going to destroy the earth with water next time, it will be fire. The word he uses in the Hebrew to talk about destroy is about restoring, that the essence is still there, right? But I'm going to make it new, and I'm going to make it whole like it was intended to be. You and I have a difficult time with that. I mean, even though I can talk about forest management and what that looks like, we still struggle with that because we still are in a sinful state of mind, because we have not been fully restored. We have not been fully redeemed, right? But the point that God is trying to make is that what he created at the beginning was what he intended. Sin entered and man fell and left that up and messed that up. But God ever since then has been working towards the restoration of that. The nation of Israel coming together as a group. The Messiah coming from Israel, right? The Messiah living, dying, buried, resurrected, ascended, so that we might know eternal life, so that we would know restoration here, so that when he gets to this place of restoring everything to its fully redeemed state, it would be exactly as God intended. Okay. And so we need to understand that when he sees this new heaven and this new earth, he just and he just sees, wow, you know? I mean, I think of scenes in movies where, people have all of a sudden opened curtains to went to rooms and looked outside and sunshine and greenery and beauty, and that's exactly what John sees. I have seen pictures during this pandemic of cities all around the world where pollution fog is lifted because early on, especially, cars were not out as much and factories were shut down. And so the pollution was beginning to dissipate. And the beauty was absolutely amazing, right? Just a glimpse of what John sees there, right? As that final judgment happens for unbelievers and everyone then is thrown into the lake of fire, death, Hades, all the unbelievers with Satan, with the beast, all that is gone and cannot in any way influence or hurt the earth anymore, right? That's the picture that John is seeing, right? And so many people ask, well, what's that going to look like? Okay, we are living in a glimpse of what that will look like, because that's God's intent, is to restore and redeem. Okay, and that's what John sees there when he talks about this new heaven and this new earth, a restored heaven and a restored earth. But not only does he see a new heaven and a new earth, all right? And here's a point. My mother-in-law asked me about this because some preachers have talked about it. And I'll be honest with you, it was not something that was on my radar until she asked me about it. So I did a little digging. Because at the end of verse 1, it says, and the sea was no more. Now, I think it was Chuck Swindoll, she said, was preaching on this. And I think Greg Laurie's preached on it. I found some things from him. And if you know anything about those guys, they're beach bums. And our family, if you're the kind of family that when you vacation, you love going to the beach, everybody talks about the beach being their happy place. They're like, what's going to happen to the beach? Well, this is where a good understanding of what Scripture has to say, right? Because think about the images that the Old Testament and the New Testament paint about the sea, right? We see things like mystery. We see things like rebellion, right? It's painted as the ocean, right? In James, we talk about the waves of the sea tossing us back and forth with temptation and trials and troubles coming persistently and consistently, this perpetual unrest, right? This division, because one of the things that's one of my seminary friends I say is that what John saw, he was on the Isle of Patmos and the Borean Sea was keeping him from ministering to his church. So there's divisions that we see, potentially even the land divisions that we see, right? And so I truly believe what John is seeing here and what God is showing is that those divisions will be gone. Now, what the sea will look like at that point, I don't know. What the land will look like, again, will the continents come back together and just be one? Or I don't know. But I do believe that the point that John is trying to make is that the sea will be different because God created it, right? In Genesis 1, as a part of the original intent for us to live in and be a part of. But then it became this picture of unrest and uncertainty and rebellion all throughout the Old Testament. And it is, and Tammy's absolutely right. It's where the beast came out of, right? So there is this intention, whether it's something physical and spiritual that will take place, right? But the sea will be different. In other words, and I think that's the point he's trying to make with the whole thing, is that the earth as we know it will be different. The sea as we know it will be different. The cosmos as we know it will be different, right? Because, a Jewish person by nature, that you have very few Jewish sailors, right? And even in John's day, people would have been like, oh, wow, the sea will be gone. And so some of that restlessness, think about it. What natural disaster does God use out in the seas to clean out the atmosphere? Hurricanes, right? Those kind of things won't be needed anymore. And so um, whether the oceans as we know them will be around, I can't tell you. I'd like to think so because I love to be in the ocean. I love to swim. But something about it will be significantly different for us as we are with God in eternity. Okay? Well, the next thing that he sees, and this is beautiful, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Now, here's where we have to understand how John writes in the pictures that he's seeing, right? Because in chapter 19, we saw the bride prepared, adorned, being the church, being the believers, the marriage supper of the Lamb, all of those things taking place together. Okay? I'm not convinced that right here that is the full picture because I think what it truly points out here, because there's no direct article here. This is not the bride, but prepared as a bride. And when we get to verse 9 just a little bit, I think you'll see what I'm talking about, right? So it not necessarily here is he talking about the church or the bride of Christ necessarily coming down, right? But he's beginning to point to something that will be a radical opposition to what we've seen during the judgment time. Keep the scarlet woman in mind here, okay? And so God begins to expand. I truly believe he begins to expand on this picture of the bride of Christ, not just being the people, but also representative of a city and a system that we will see in the end times. Okay. And then this is beautiful. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, and who is that? God. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. They will be his people or peoples. It is in the plural. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. I think especially as 21st century believers, we struggle at times with fully grasping what's taking place here. And we talked about it a little bit last week when we talked about the millennial reign, about how we would be priests during that time. And the only priestly function is that we would have direct access to God through Christ, that Christ would be here in the millennial reign. But this is a different picture that is being painted, right? Because this parallels with the words that God used when he created the earth at the beginning in Genesis. It also, if you remember, in John chapter 1, in the Gospel of John in chapter 1, the Word became man or became flesh and dwelt among us. That Greek word means tabernacled. Okay? And if you remember, prior to the fall, God and man interacted personally in the garden, right? I mean, that was implied because after the fall, when God's walking through the garden looking for man, man is there. And so there's this implication that prior to the fall, there was this face-to-face, personal, intimate connection that was not separated because of sin. And so I think we need to fully understand exactly what God is saying here, because we've talked about, with Jesus' death on the cross, the curtain breaking, being torn from top to bottom because God tore it. The priest no longer had to go into the temple or into the Holy of Holies to make atonement for us. All right. We had access to God. We could go to him and say, Lord, I need this, but there was not that personal. He was not sitting here much like Tammy is sitting right here. But here we have this sense that God has tabernacled or pitched his tent among men, among us. And he will be our God, and he will be. And we need to fully get that, all right? Because this is not just being able to pray to him. This is there is a sense of personal contact. I can't tell you what God looks like because it's not going to be a human form or anything like that, right? But we have this sense, and as we see when we get into the New Jerusalem and what that looks like, you'll see why he uses the word tabernacle, because God then becomes everything that the tabernacle, the earthly tabernacle that was built, was intended to be from the very beginning. All right, and we'll see some of that in the descriptions of what we see. But God dwells among, and in other words, he'll be right here, right? And that's difficult, again, for us to fully grasp because of our sinful nature, because we're still separated. And that's the point, is that sin will be gone. The new heaven and the new earth will be here. There'll no longer be that barrier of sin anymore, fully restored, and God being right here. And I just, my mind goes absolutely nuts thinking about the potential of that and what that will be like for us, and what that even will be like for him, but especially for us, in just having that kind of access. I'm just amazed. I think the closest that we can come is understanding that as adopted sons, we're created in the image of God, but then we're adopted by him through, as his sons, through Jesus Christ, and that puts us in his family. And as you'll see, as he'll talk some about that heritage and what that looks like, but just the personableness of what is taking place when God dwells among men, not just in our hearts anymore, okay? He will be here in fullness. We will be able to see him and encounter him in his fullness with no barriers anymore. Not just the curtain being taken down from the temple, but the sinful nature, right? Christ will no longer have to be our mediator at that point, because we will be full sons and daughters with Christ in heaven then. I can't say enough about this picture that's being painted. And then look at what he will do. And people talk about this one all the time. Tammy and I had a great discussion about it recently, because people love to say there'll be no tears in heaven, right? Not 100%, right? And this is where it comes from. Because look at what God says he will do. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. What are those former things? That sinful nature. That sinful nature that caused separation between us and God. That sinful nature that caused separation between me and family members. That sinful nature that caused separation between me and friends. That sinful nature that caused separation between me and my fellow man. Maybe because of the color of their skin, or the language that they speak, or the neighborhood that they live in. That sinful nature will be gone. The former things have passed away. And as a result, I will truly, genuinely, and fully be able to see people the way God does. Okay? No more pain, no more mourning, no more sorrow. That's where the tears are gone, because those incidents in our lives are what bring it. It is the mourning that brings about the tears, right? It is the pain that is inflicted or that we cause that brings about the tears. Right? And so the tears associated with this are tears of sorrow, tears of mourning. All right. And I just can't help think. I think about when I worship, whether it's in a setting like this with fellow believers, or whether it's when I'm by myself, just communing with God, and worship takes place, and I experience God. And yeah, the sun just hit. And I experience God in his fullness and his presence. And there is this peace, there is this conviction, that there is this knowledge, or whatever you want to call it. And people who know me know that I don't hold it back. I cry, but I'm not sad. I'm not crying as when I cried when David died. I'm not crying as when my grandmother died. I'm crying because I'm in the presence of God, and just the joy, those tears of joy that come. I tend to think some of that will still take place in heaven, those types of tears, but they will not be tears of mourning or sorrow. Okay? Because again, new heaven, new earth, we have been restored. The bodies that we have, it will look very much like what we have now, is what those heavenly bodies will look like. Okay? So he's going to wipe away all those things, and all that stuff will be gone. And then he goes on to say in verse 5, and he who was seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. Also he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. And behold, he was sitting on the throne. Says again, makes another announcement. Behold, I'm making all things new. Us, the earth around us, the cosmos, everything. I'm making all things new. Right? And then he says to John, write this down, because these words are trustworthy and true. It is done. I'm the Alpha and the Omega. We know what that means. First and last letters of the Greek alphabet, right? He is the beginning. He is the end. But the word telos here for Omega, right? It's not just about the ending of events. We talk about something coming to an end, like you retire, so your job comes to an end or something like that. It's not just that the tribulation comes to an end, all right? It's not that anything that God has done is coming to an end. The word here, it points more towards a completion of purpose, that God's plan is now ultimately fulfilled. Started when he said, let there be light. Continued when he drew the nation of Israel to himself and made them a nation. Continued when out of that nation of Israel the Messiah was born. Continued as Jesus lived his life and ministered here on earth. Continued as Jesus was beaten and crucified, died. Continued when Jesus was buried and then resurrected and ascended. Now is continued as the tribulation came to an end, as sin was brought to full recompense, right? As Satan was finally defeated and thrown into the lake of fire, the beast and all that thrown into the lake of fire, sinners, unbelievers thrown into the lake of fire. It is done. God's purposes are accomplished. It is complete. And so he's saying to John, write it down. Because how many times have we said up until this point, God's showing us he's a God of his word, right? He says it, he promises it, he's going to do it, right? We talked about that with the judgments. We talked about that with sin and the payment for sin, right? Now we're seeing it completely when God said, I will fully restore, right? When God said, not with fire, not with water next time, but fire, right? When he promised the nation of Israel that they would be restored. When he said to the people that I will send you a Messiah, I will make the path. And that's exactly what God is saying, is that this is my work. You had nothing to do with it at all. And so he's telling John, write that down. Let people hear that. Let people read that. Let people know that God is the one orchestrating all of history to get to this place and what this will look like. Okay? And then he goes on, and here he preaches, right? And because he wants John to say these things, because here's another of those, that outreach to say the why. To the thirsty, I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. Right? And the thirst, that's a spiritual thirst that he's talking about, this hunger, this desire that we have in our spirit to know Christ. Right? And then as we come to know Christ, it remains and it strengthens because we want to know him deeper. We want to know him more personally. We have this thirst deep inside that can only be quenched by him. And he says, I fulfill that hunger without payment. I am, how thankful should we be for that, right? That God fulfills our hunger without payment. He sent Jesus to pay the price for our sin. Nothing we could do. He called us to himself and we surrendered to him. Nothing we could do. He paid the price. He took care of the final judgment. He took care of the beast. He took care of Satan. Nothing we can do. It's the water of life without payment. Again, just emphasizing it's not about the works that we do or anything like that. It's about surrendering to God. Okay? And here's the follow-up promise. The one who conquers, remember we heard that in some of the charges to the 7 churches, right? To the one who conquers, I will give. To the one who conquers, basically overcomes, all right, and stands firm and stands strong on the foundation of Christ, will have this heritage. Adopted sons and daughters of the Heavenly Father. This will be our heritage, this new heaven, this new earth, the new Jerusalem about to come down. This will be our heritage. Everything that falls in line with being a son of God and a daughter of God, God is promising yes. But then he offers another final warning. But to the cowardly, to the faithless, the detestable, all those folks, there is no place, and their portion will be in the lake of fire. So there is an inheritance one way or the other. There is eternal life one way or the other, right? But it depends on what we do here and where we seek that thirst to be fulfilled. Okay. Am I real bright? Okay. Where we seek that thirst to be fulfilled. Right? And a couple of things I want to point out here. Cowardly is not something, it's not a word that's used to describe someone who is afraid. That's not what we're talking about. The word here truly means detestable, right? Because I think about people that are truly sinners, especially what we saw in some of the judgments themselves, right? But miserable, wretched, detestable, all about them, very selfish, self-centered, trying to get as much as they can, right? We saw that in the beast. We saw that in the Scarlet Woman, right, who was the harlot, right? Even though there was a system that made everybody lots of money, they were miserable, they were cowardly because it was about them. And even when the system began to fall apart, you saw the beast turn against the woman, right? Cowardly when you do things like that. That's what cowardly is talking about. The other one I just want to point out, because I think my Bible says sorcerers. I think the NIV says practice of magic, practice of the magic arts. Kind of reminds you of Harry Potter, right? When he talks about the practice of the dark arts. Practice of magic or practice of the magical arts of sorcery. The word there is pharmakos. And the implication of that word is, especially when you use drugs and things of that nature to seduce and manipulate and to take advantage of people. But again, another plea. People that live in this lifestyle, this selfish lifestyle that is only about themselves, they say, God says, that there's no place for you in heaven. Your place will be in the lake of fire, which is the second death. All right. Again, a reminder to us to who are those people around us that potentially fit into some of these categories. People that are selfish, sexually immoral, people who use drugs to manipulate themselves and other people, whatever it may be. Who are some of those folks? Idolaters. I mean, think about idolatry. You know, we've talked about idolatry is not just about this little idol that you have, but it's anything you put before God. Could be your job, could be your family, could be yourself that you put before God. All of those people, who are those that we need to share the story with? Okay. So God paints this picture of the new heaven and the new earth. And the other thing that John saw was the new Jerusalem, the holy city coming down. This, and we're going to land here for a little bit because there are things that we need to see, because this helps us fully understand, I think, a lot of what potentially living in heaven and the new earth will look like. Oh, I'm fine. Tammy's trying to get an umbrella on me here to keep the sunshine off of me. That's okay. I could still use the tan. Okay. So let's look in verse 9. Then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. And on the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were 12 names, the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width, and he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. He also measured its wall 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. The wall was built of jasper, while the city was pure gold, like clear glass. The foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst, and the 12 gates were 12 pearls. One of the gates made of a single pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. I can't say enough about what I read right here, right? Because here's, I believe, the picture that is being painted, right? I want you to see in 21 verse 9 a direct parallel to chapter 17, right? And let me just read it to you real quick. Verse 1 of chapter 17. See if these words don't sound familiar to what we just read. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and the wine of whose sexual immorality and dwellers of the earth have become drunk. In verse 9, then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride of the Lamb. Verse 10, he says, And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain. Verse 3 of 17, And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman seated on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names. Verse 10 of chapter 21, And a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. This parallel, this use of the same words is no accident. No. And that's why I believe that what we're seeing is an expansion of what we saw in 19 about the bride of Christ. Yes, the bride of Christ in 19 specifically is about the believers that are coming down, prepared, marriage supper of the Lamb. But what we're also seeing is this expansion of it now, and the effect of what it will look like in the new heaven and the new earth, because I truly believe what we see taking place is that Jerusalem will become the center of all activity, all spiritual activity within the new heaven and the new earth. Right? And God is making a significant comparison, because what was it about that scarlet woman? She was a prostitute. And remember, we said it was a system, a worldly system set up that benefited people to the point that they became selfish and cruel, selling even human beings to the point that we don't even understand today, right? And it was a system of selfishness, all about personal gain. It was wicked, everything about it. That's why John sees it out in a wilderness. Here, John is taken up to a high mountain to see the beauty of this city. And as we move through this description, I think you'll understand why this comparison, all right? Because it will be the center of activity. In other words, this bride of Christ, the New Jerusalem, is kind of the place where all of that beautiful activity will take place. Everything that we were intended to be, everything that we were intended to do when God said, let there be light, when he created the heavens and the earth, when he created man, all right? and put him here, gave him the woman beside him to subdue and to steward the earth. All of that praise will now be focused to God in the temple, and that temple, God himself will be located in the city of Jerusalem. Is it going to be a real city? Yes. Will there be real cities today then like we know now? Yes. Because again, the earth is not completely annihilated. It is just restored and redeemed. And so a lot of what we see now, even some of the ways that we do things now, I believe, will be there. And we will do those things. Okay? Having the glory of God, verse 11, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper clear as crystal. The woman was described as a woman of scarlet, which is always used to describe someone who was sinful and immoral and was selfish, right? And who was out for her own gain, doing her own thing, much like we see with Jezebel in the Old Testament, right? But here we have a woman adorned with great jewels, clear as crystal, rare in its radiance, having the glory of God. Beautiful comparison, beautiful contrast to the difference in what was destroyed in 17 and what is now what this will look like now. To say that you had this system, this scarlet woman, this Babylonian type of work taking place that was impure, it was unholy, all of those things, now to a bride that is presented pure and holy to her groom with everything focused on God. Can't can't emphasize that more. All right, is that God is showing moving forward. This will be the center of activity in heaven. And look at some of the descriptions as we move forward. Okay, and I think it's kind of cool too, especially, and you can grasp this as we move into the system, that he had to take John up on this high mountain to see this. Okay, because when you begin to see the size of this city, yeah, he'd have to get up pretty high to just be able to grasp even just a glimpse of it. You know, all you can see is this cube when he gets there. But verse 12, and it had a great high wall, 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. It had a great high wall, 12 gates, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? And it is interesting here because it says at the gates were 12 angels. I don't think they're necessarily standing guard to keep people from coming in. There are some who have asked the question, is it one angel per gate, or are there 12 at each gate? That's not 100% clear. We just know there's angels there, and they're standing there, sentries, they're standing there, but it becomes clear later they're not there to keep people out. I believe they're almost like doormen welcoming folks to come in. Welcome to the city, right? Because the focus, as we see as we move forward to this, the focus is the city becomes a central place where everyone comes, right, to worship and to bring all the glory that God intended to come to this place so they can thank God for all that he's done, right? And on the gates are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. Now, don't ask me if Joseph is one of them because I don't know, because I really don't know. It just says the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. 3, 3, and 3, right? And underneath this city were 12 foundations. On them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Foundations, and people have asked, well, why weren't the tribes the foundation? Isn't that where it started? No. I mean, it did start there. Don't hear me say that. It did start there, right? But the tribes were the entryway. The tribes were what got it started at the beginning. As the apostles came along and Jesus began to teach his disciples and they began to develop and take God's word to the rest of the known world, that becomes the foundation then of everything that is taking place, right? But the beautiful part is that you see Old and New Testament coming together for one thing, to accomplish God's purpose, to accomplish God's plan. to dwell with man, right? I think I'm going to stop right there because it's almost 10 o'clock and I don't want to get into, um, we'll pick it up next week. But I hope that you'll go back and read some more and that you'll read regularly and even find some other folks who offer commentary about it. Um, because this picture that God is painting of the New Jerusalem, the new heaven, the new earth is so important for us to grasp because this is the key to truly understanding and appreciating everything that God is doing in this end time. Because it's not just about the wrath, that's just a piece of it. We begin to understand in these last two chapters exactly what God is doing and why he's doing it. Okay. Next week, when we go 15 through the end of 22, we're going to look at the size of the city, the beauty of the city, the resources of the city, how things are, how people actually live, and what's going on. Okay, and then we'll talk about those final words that God gives. Um, if you have questions, certainly message me. If you email me, if you have my email, we want to make sure folks are clear. I will let you know sometime this week what we'll be doing, where we'll be doing it next week. Um, it is Labor Day weekend, so we may punt a little bit and do something different. I don't know. Tam and I will talk about that. But we love you, and I thank God for each of you. One more Sunday, and we will be finished with Revelation. So God bless you, and have a great week. Can't see a blessed thing. Get back up here in the shade so I can see what I'm doing here. Where'd it go?